The morning of February 19th, 1945, began with a sound that no man who heard it ever forgot. On the beaches of Iwo Jima, as the first light broke over Mount Suribachi, the ocean itself seemed to have transformed into a highway of steel. Vice Admiral Sadaichi Tomano stood in the concrete command bunker overlooking the eastern beaches, his field glasses pressed to his face, and for the first time in his 32-year military career, he found himself unable to speak. What he saw was impossible. The American fleet stretching to the horizon was not remarkable in itself. Japan had grown accustomed to the sight of enemy warships, but what approached the shore defied every calculation, every assessment, every strategic assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy had made about American industrial capacity. Landing craft, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They came in waves, their flat bows cutting through the surf, disgorging marines and tanks and artillery onto the black volcanic sand, and behind them, more appeared, and behind those, still more. Tomano lowered his glasses. His hands, steady through a dozen battles, trembled slightly. He turned to his operations officer, a captain who had studied at the Naval War College in Tokyo, who had written papers on amphibious warfare, who had assured the High Command that American production capabilities, while substantial, were ultimately finite. How many landing craft did intelligence estimate the Americans possessed in the entire Pacific theater? Tomano asked quietly. The captain consulted his briefing folder, though both men knew the number by heart. Approximately 800 to 1,000 vessels suitable for amphibious assault, Admiral. Tomano pointed toward the sea. Count them, he said. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that haunted Japanese commanders from that morning forward was simple, profound, and ultimately unanswerable within their framework of understanding. Where had these vessels come from? The intelligence had not been wrong 3 years earlier. In 1942, the United States possessed almost no purpose-built landing craft. The few that existed were experimental, untested, produced in small numbers. Yet here, in early 1945, they materialized as if summoned from nothing, an armada of utilitarian steel boxes that rewrote the rules of naval warfare. This was not mere miscalculation. It represented a failure of imagination so complete, so total, that it called into question every assumption upon which Japan had built its war strategy. The men in Tokyo who had planned the Greater East Asia War had factored in American naval strength, air power, even the eventual development of long-range bombers, but they had not, could not, conceive of a nation that would produce landing craft the way other nations produced bullets. Industrial capacity at a scale that transformed logistics itself into a weapon. Admiral Tomano would survive the Battle of Iwo Jima, though most of his garrison would not. In his diary, captured after the war, he recorded his thoughts from that morning. "I understood then," he wrote, "that we had not been fighting a nation. We had been fighting a factory that happened to have an army and navy attached to it." The profound irony of the Pacific War crystallized in that moment on that beach. Japan had struck first, believing speed and tactical excellence could overcome industrial disadvantage. But by the time Japanese commanders understood what American industry could actually produce, understanding came too late to matter. The landing craft that filled the waters off Iwo Jima were not accidents of fortune or temporary surges in production. They represented a transformation of warfare itself, a revolution in military logistics so complete that it rendered obsolete every defensive strategy Japan had devised. To understand how this happened, how a nation produced vessels in such numbers that enemy commanders literally could not believe their eyes, we must return to the moment when everything changed. To 1942, when America possessed almost nothing, and Japan possessed the Pacific. In the early months of 1942, Japan stood astride an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the approaches of Australia, from the frozen Kuril Islands to the steaming jungles of New Guinea. The speed of conquest had shocked even the most optimistic planners in Tokyo. Hong Kong, fallen in 18 days. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in 70 days. The Philippines, conquered in 5 months. The Dutch East Indies, swept up in a campaign of breathtaking efficiency. This expansion had not been blind aggression. It rested on careful calculation, on assessments made by some of the finest strategic minds Japan possessed. At the Naval War College in Tokyo, in the offices of the Army General Staff, in the planning rooms of the Combined Fleet, officers had spent years studying one central question. Could Japan defeat the United States in a prolonged war? The answer, they concluded, was no. But the right question, they believed, was different. Could Japan seize territory so quickly, establish defenses so formidable, that America would negotiate rather than pay the blood price of reconquest? To this question, they answered yes. The calculation rested on specific assumptions about American capability and will. Japanese planners knew the United States possessed greater industrial capacity. This was not in dispute. American steel production exceeded Japan's by a factor of 5 to 1, oil production 12 to 1. The numbers were sobering, even terrifying. But numbers, the strategists argued, did not tell the complete story. Industrial capacity mattered only if it could be converted into military power and projected across the Pacific Ocean. And here, Japan believed it held crucial advantages. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Amphibious warfare, the art of projecting power from sea to land, was extraordinarily difficult. It required specialized vessels, trained troops, complex coordination between naval and ground forces. The disasters at Gallipoli in the First World War had demonstrated what happened when amphibious assaults failed. The British and French had possessed naval superiority, more troops, better artillery, yet they had been pinned on the beaches and eventually evacuated, defeated not by Turkish strength but by the inherent difficulty of amphibious operations. Japan's own experience reinforced this assessment. The Imperial Japanese Army had conducted amphibious operations in China, in the Philippines, throughout the East Indies. These had succeeded, but they were operations across short distances against weak opposition, and still they had proven costly and complex. Each landing required careful planning, specialized equipment, and often resulted in chaos on the beaches, even when successful. The idea that America could conduct such operations across thousands of miles of ocean against prepared Japanese defenses seemed to require capabilities that simply did not exist. Intelligence reports from 1942 supported this conclusion. American landing craft production was minimal. The Navy possessed a handful of Higgins boats, wooden-hulled vessels designed for small-scale operations. There were experimental tracked vehicles, a few tank lighters, nothing suggesting industrial commitment to amphibious warfare. The United States was building destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers. These made sense. But purpose-built landing craft in large numbers? The intelligence showed no evidence of it. Japanese defensive doctrine evolved from these assumptions. The strategy was called shogo, victory operation, though its real purpose was less victory than exhaustion. Japan would fortify key islands with troops, artillery, and supplies. When Americans attempted to land, they would face defenders in prepared positions, firing from caves and bunkers, supplied by tunnels, willing to fight to the last man. Each island would become a fortress, requiring months to capture, thousands of casualties to secure. The mathematics seemed favorable. If each fortified island cost America 5,000 casualties and 6 months of fighting, and Japan had dozens of such islands stretching across the Pacific, the war would last years. American public opinion, Japanese planners believed, would not sustain losses on such a scale for such a duration. A negotiated peace would become preferable to endless island-by-island slaughter. The plan was not to win, but to make winning so costly that America would choose not to pay the price. This strategy had one critical vulnerability that Japanese planners failed to fully appreciate. It assumed that American forces would need to take every island, that bypassing strong points was impossible, that projecting power across vast distances required capturing each intermediate position. In other words, it assumed that amphibious capability would remain limited, specialized, expensive, It assumed that landing craft would remain scarce enough to matter. In the spring of 1942, while Japanese forces consolidated their conquests across the Pacific, a boat builder in New Orleans was about to transform the nature of modern warfare. Andrew Jackson Higgins was not a military man. He had never attended West Point or Annapolis, never studied tactics or strategy at any war college. He built boats for oil companies working in Louisiana swamps, shallow draft vessels that could navigate bayous and channels where conventional boats would ground. His design was simple to the point of crude. A flat-bottomed plywood hull, 36 feet long, with a bow that could drop down to form a ramp. The engine, a diesel from a grey marine truck, provided enough power to push the boat to 9 knots. It could carry 36 combat-equipped troops or a small vehicle. It drew so little water that it could approach almost any beach, drop its ramp, discharge its cargo, and reverse off into deeper water. Higgins called it the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel. The military would call it the Higgins boat. The genius of the design lay not in sophistication but in simplicity. Every component was standard, interchangeable, available from civilian suppliers. The plywood came from lumber mills, the engine from truck manufacturers, the steel ramp from any fabrication shop. Nothing exotic, nothing requiring specialized tooling or rare materials. A moderately skilled crew could assemble one in a matter of weeks. More importantly, production could scale, not incrementally, but exponentially. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The United States military initially showed limited interest. The Marine Corps conducted tests and approved the design for small-scale use. Orders trickled in, dozens at a time. But in Washington, in the months after Pearl Harbor, strategic planners were beginning to grasp a fundamental reality. To reach Japan, American forces would need to project power across the Pacific. Island hopping was not optional but necessary, and island hopping at the scale required meant amphibious assaults, many of them, which meant landing craft. Thousands of them. President Franklin Roosevelt, reviewing production plans in early 1942, made a decision that would reshape the war. He ordered landing craft production prioritized at a level normally reserved for warships and aircraft. The numbers he demanded seemed impossible. 10,000 landing craft. 20,000. Production not in years but in months. To conventional thinking, such numbers were fantasy. The shipyards building destroyers and carriers could not possibly retool for landing craft. The specialized naval construction facilities were already operating at capacity. But Roosevelt understood something that Japanese planners did not. America's industrial strength lay not primarily in its massive shipyards, but in its thousands of small manufacturers, its furniture makers and truck plants and machine shops. These facilities could not build aircraft carriers, but they could build landing craft. And in a nation with over 150,000 manufacturing establishments, scale became possible. The War Production Board issued contracts not to a handful of major shipbuilders, but to hundreds of small companies across the nation. Furniture factories in Michigan built plywood hulls. Machine shops in Pennsylvania fabricated ramps. Engine plants in Detroit assembled power plants. The components were shipped by rail to assembly points where Higgins's workers, many of them women who had never built boats before, put them together with remarkable speed. By the end of 1942, Higgins Industries alone was producing 700 landing craft per month, not per year. Per month. The company employed 20,000 workers operating around the clock in multiple shifts. In New Orleans, in a facility that had built pleasure boats before the war, workers assembled more landing craft in a single week than the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed in its entire inventory. And Higgins was only one manufacturer among hundreds. The scale defied precedent. In 1943, American industry produced over 23,000 landing craft of various types. In 1944, production exceeded 31,000 vessels. By the war's end, the total would reach over 41,000 landing craft, more than the entire merchant marine of most nations. These were not ships in the traditional sense. They were industrial products, manufactured with the same methods and scale as automobiles or refrigerators. Warfare had been industrialized not just in weaponry but in logistics itself. Japanese intelligence officers, reading reports of American production claims, dismissed them as propaganda. The numbers were too large to be credible. No nation could build ships at such a rate. Ships required shipyards, skilled labor, specialized facilities. The reports must be exaggerated, designed to demoralize Japanese forces and impress neutral nations. Even if partially true, the craft must be of poor quality, hastily built vessels that would prove unseaworthy or break down in actual operations. This became the assessment that Japanese commanders accepted. American landing craft existed, certainly, but not in the numbers claimed, and not with the reliability to sustain extended campaigns. This miscalculation would prove fatal, because by late 1943, American forces were not merely planning amphibious operations. They were conducting them on a scale that rewrote military doctrine, and every operation revealed the same reality. When landing craft existed in such numbers that losses did not matter, when production exceeded consumption by factors of 10 or 20, the entire strategic calculus of island defense collapsed. The Higgins boat that carried Marines onto Guadalcanal beaches in August 1942 bore serial number LCVP-1412. It had been assembled in New Orleans 37 days earlier by a crew that included 2 former furniture makers, a high school mathematics teacher, and 3 women who had worked in a cannery before the war. The hull consisted of 5 sheets of 3/4-inch marine plywood, joined with waterproof glue and reinforced with steel strakes. Total material cost, $427. Construction time, 106 man-hours. By comparison, a standard Navy destroyer required 18 months to build and cost approximately $6 million. An Essex-class aircraft carrier took nearly 3 years and cost $70 million. The Higgins boat represented a fundamentally different approach to naval warfare. It was expendable, replaceable, produced in such quantities that individual losses became statistically irrelevant. If 10 landing craft were destroyed getting troops ashore, 50 more were already in production to replace them. If a beach assault required 100 craft and only 70 survived, production could make up the deficit within a week. The production process itself was revolutionary. Higgins Industries divided construction into 17 distinct subassemblies. Each subassembly was built by a specialized team that did nothing else. Team 7, for instance, installed the engine and transmission. They performed this task 40 times per day, developing an efficiency that cut installation time from 8 hours to 90 minutes. Team 12 mounted the bow ramp and hydraulic system. Their productivity improved from 1 installation per shift to 5. The cumulative effect of such specialization allowed the company to reduce total assembly time from 106 hours to 62 hours within 6 months. Materials came from across the nation. The Grey Marine diesel engines were manufactured in Detroit at a rate of 800 per month. Propellers were cast in Pennsylvania foundries, then machined in Ohio tool shops. The plywood came primarily from Oregon and Washington mills, which had converted from furniture-grade wood to marine plywood production. At peak output, these mills produced enough plywood to build 200 landing craft hulls per day. The logistics of supplying Higgins Industries alone required 37 freight trains per week, each carrying components from dozens of suppliers. Quality control operated on statistical rather than individual inspection. Every 50th landing craft underwent complete testing, including full load trials, ramp cycling tests, and seaworthiness evaluation. If defects appeared, the entire batch of 50 was inspected. Otherwise, craft were shipped directly to staging areas without individual trials. This approach, borrowed from automobile manufacturing, horrified traditional shipbuilders. Every vessel should be individually tested, they insisted. But the numbers made individual testing impossible. At production rates exceeding 700 craft per month from Higgins alone, there were not enough hours in the day to test each one. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Higgins boat was only one type among many. The LCM, Landing Craft Mechanized, could carry a 30-ton Sherman tank. It was larger, heavier, built of welded steel rather than plywood, and required more sophisticated construction. Yet American industry produced over 8,600 LCMs during the war. The LCT, Landing Craft Tank, displaced 280 tons and could transport 5 Sherman tanks or 9 trucks. Over 1,400 were built. The LST, Landing Ship Tank, was a sea-going vessel 328 feet long, capable of crossing oceans and landing directly on beaches. American shipyards produced over 1,050 LSTs between 1942 and 1945. Each type served specific purposes, but together they created a system of overwhelming capacity. An amphibious assault against a defended beach required different types of craft working in coordination. LSTs carried heavy equipment across oceans. LCTs ferried tanks from LSTs to beaches. LCMs brought trucks and artillery ashore. LCVPs landed infantry. The system's redundancy meant that losing one type did not halt operations. If LCVPs were scarce, troops could land from LCMs. If LCTs were unavailable, tanks could wait for LSTs to beach directly. Japanese defenders preparing positions on islands across the Pacific based their calculations on conventional amphibious doctrine. A landing force would arrive with limited craft, make a few waves of assaults, then pause to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. This pause offered opportunities for counterattack, for reinforcing threatened sectors, for bringing artillery to bear on troops still disorganized on the beaches. The doctrine assumed scarcity, that landing craft were precious resources to be carefully husbanded and protected. American operations increasingly violated these assumptions. At Tarawa, in November 1943, despite horrific casualties and operational problems, American forces continued landing troops throughout the first day without pause. When craft were damaged or destroyed, more appeared. When one beach became too congested, other beaches were developed. The sheer number of available vessels meant that momentum could be sustained regardless of losses. Japanese defenders, firing from prepared positions, destroyed dozens of landing craft, but dozens more kept coming. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was profound. Training had emphasized that Americans, though numerically superior and well-equipped, could be defeated through superior fighting spirit and tactical skill. But how does fighting spirit counter an enemy who can lose 100 landing craft and not pause? How does tactical skill matter when the enemy can simply absorb casualties and continue landing troops until defenders run out of ammunition? The material abundance of American logistics began to create a sense of futility among Japanese soldiers. They could fight perfectly, inflict maximum casualties, and still lose because the enemy could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. On the morning of June 15, 1944, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito stood on the heights overlooking the western beaches of Saipan and experienced something close to despair. He commanded 32,000 troops, the largest garrison Japan had assembled on any island in the Central Pacific. His men occupied fortified positions in caves and bunkers, supported by artillery carefully sighted to cover the beaches. Intelligence had warned him that an American assault was imminent. He had prepared as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. What he saw through his field glasses that morning broke something fundamental in his understanding of the war. The American fleet offshore was vast, over 500 ships, but Saito had seen large fleets before. What paralyzed him was the landing craft. They filled the sea between the fleet and the shore like a carpet of steel, hundreds visible at once, with more launching from the larger ships behind them. They came in organized waves, precisely spaced, moving toward the beaches with mechanical inevitability. Saito's artillery opened fire. Coastal defense guns, emplaced in caves and bunkers, began systematic bombardment of the approaching craft. The Japanese gunners were experienced, accurate, Several landing craft took direct hits and exploded or capsized. Others were struck and disabled, drifting sideways as smoke poured from their engines. Saito watched through his glasses, counting the kills. 15 craft destroyed in the first wave, 20 more in the second wave. By mid-morning, his gunners had destroyed or disabled over 60 American landing craft, and it made no difference whatsoever. For every craft destroyed, 3 more appeared. The waves continued without pause, without any sign that losses affected the operation. Troops poured onto the beaches in numbers that overwhelmed the defensive plan. Saito had positioned his men to create killing zones on the beaches, areas where concentrated fire would destroy landing forces, before they could organize. But the doctrine assumed that losses would slow or halt the landings, that there would be pauses he could exploit. Instead, the Americans simply accepted casualties and kept coming. By afternoon, over 20,000 American troops were ashore. Saito's reports to Tokyo emphasized the unexpectedly large number of landing craft. Intelligence had estimated the Americans might have 200 to 300 craft available for the Saipan operation. Saito counted at least 700 actively participating in the landing, with more visible in reserve. His operations officer suggested that perhaps the Americans had concentrated all available landing craft from across the Pacific for this single assault, weakening their capabilities elsewhere. It was a comforting theory. It was also completely wrong. At the same moment, American forces were assaulting Saipan. Other operations were underway across the Pacific. In New Guinea, Australian and American forces were conducting amphibious landings supported by over 200 landing craft. In the Solomons, operations continued with another 100 craft. Supplies were being moved to forward bases throughout the theatre, using hundreds more. The landing craft at Saipan represented not a concentration of all available resources, but a routine allocation for a single major operation. Japanese intelligence officers in Tokyo received Saito's reports with growing alarm. The numbers did not make sense. If the Americans had 700 craft at Saipan, 200 in New Guinea, and hundreds more scattered across the Pacific, they must possess several thousand landing craft in total. But several thousand vessels of any type represented a major naval commitment. Where had they come from? How had intelligence failed to detect construction on such a scale? The answer, when it finally emerged from decoded American communications and captured documents, was almost harder to believe than ignorance. The Americans had not built several thousand landing craft. They had built tens of thousands. Production had not been concentrated in a few major shipyards where Japanese intelligence could track it. It had been distributed across hundreds of small manufacturers, furniture factories and boat builders and machine shops, facilities that Japanese intelligence had never thought to monitor because they were not classified as military production sites. On Saipan, the battle continued for 3 weeks. Saito's garrison fought with desperate skill and courage, but they were fighting logistics as much as soldiers. American forces ashore received continuous resupply. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, all arrived on landing craft that shuttled between beach and ships without pause. When tanks were destroyed, more tanks arrived. When artillery pieces were knocked out, replacement guns came ashore. The defenders, by contrast, had only what they had brought to the island. No resupply was possible through the American blockade. By early July, Saito's position was hopeless. His troops held only the northern portion of the island. Supplies were exhausted. On July 6th, he issued orders for a final banzai charge, a mass assault intended to die gloriously rather than surrender. Then he committed ritual suicide, a death considered honorable in Japanese military tradition. His final message to Tokyo contained one sentence that would be quoted in war planning discussions for months afterward. "The Americans do not fight with soldiers. They fight with factories." The fall of Saipan had strategic consequences beyond the island itself. It brought American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, making systematic bombing of Japanese cities possible. But it also shattered a fundamental assumption of Japanese defensive strategy. The plan had been to make each island so costly that American public opinion would demand negotiations, but that plan assumed that cost could not be indefinitely sustained, that at some point the logistics of island hopping would break down. Saipan demonstrated that American logistics were effectively unlimited, that the material basis for prolonged island hopping campaigns existed in abundance. In the weeks following Saipan's fall, Japanese military planners convened emergency strategy sessions in Tokyo. The transcripts of these meetings, captured after the war, reveal an organization struggling to comprehend a reality that contradicted every assumption upon which their strategy rested. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, opened one meeting with a question that had no good answer. If the Americans can produce landing craft in these numbers, what else have we miscalculated? The question hung in the air because everyone present knew the implications. If intelligence had failed to detect or believe landing craft production, had it also missed other production? The assessment of American industrial capacity had been the foundation of the entire war plan. Japan had struck in 1941, believing it had perhaps 2 years before American industry converted to war production and began producing overwhelming quantities of weapons. By 1944, 3 years into the war, the assumption was that American production should be approaching its peak, that the surge could not be sustained indefinitely. The landing craft numbers suggested otherwise. They suggested that American industry had not merely converted to war production, but had operated at a level Japanese planners had considered theoretically impossible. The calculations had factored in American steel production, shipyard capacity, skilled labor availability. But the calculations had assumed that manufacturing operated within conventional frameworks, that ships were built in shipyards, that production required specialized facilities and trained workers. The landing craft program demonstrated that American industry had transcended these limitations, that production could be distributed across thousands of facilities, that complexity could be simplified until ordinary workers could produce military equipment at industrial scale. Intelligence officers presented updated estimates of American production across multiple categories. In 1943, American shipyards had launched carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines totaling over 2 million tons. This alone exceeded Japanese production by a factor of 5, but the landing craft, classified separately, added another 1 million tons. Aircraft production in 1943 exceeded 95,000 planes. Tank production surpassed 29,000 vehicles. The numbers, compiled from multiple sources and cross-checked against observed deployments, were staggering. But raw production numbers told only part of the story. More disturbing was the trend. American production was not peaking but accelerating. 1944 production exceeded 1943 across nearly every category. Landing craft production, in particular, had increased by 40% year over year. The implication was clear. American industry had not yet reached its maximum capacity. The surge that Japanese planners had expected to crest and decline was still building. The strategic implications were discussed with remarkable candor, at least in classified settings. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, spoke bluntly. "We calculated that America's industrial advantage was 5-1. We believed that tactical excellence and fighting spirit could overcome 5-1 odds, at least for long enough to achieve a negotiated peace. But the advantage is not 5-1. It appears to be closer to 20-1 in some categories. No amount of fighting spirit overcomes 20-1 odds." The landing craft served as the visible symbol of this disparity because they were the most difficult to dismiss or rationalize. When Americans deployed more aircraft carriers than expected, one could attribute it to concentrating naval construction. When they fielded more tanks, one could argue they had stripped other units to mass forces for particular battles. But landing craft could not be explained away. They served no purpose except amphibious operations. Their sheer number meant they were being produced not just for immediate needs but for sustained campaigns. They represented industrial capacity deployed for a single specialized purpose, capacity so abundant that thousands of vessels could be built for one function alone. Japanese commanders in the field began adjusting their expectations accordingly. The defensive plans for the Philippines, for Iwo Jima, for Okinawa, were rewritten with the assumption that American forces would arrive with effectively unlimited landing craft, that multiple beaches could be assaulted simultaneously, that initial losses would not slow the tempo of landings. This assumption changed defensive calculations significantly. If the enemy could land anywhere, defenders could not concentrate at predicted landing sites. If the enemy could sustain losses indefinitely, inflicting casualties would not halt operations. The psychological effect on Japanese troops was equally significant. Soldiers preparing defenses on islands across the Pacific were told that their mission was to inflict maximum casualties, to make the Americans pay such a price for each island that they would eventually negotiate. But the veterans of Saipan, the survivors who had been evacuated before the final collapse, or who had hidden in caves and were later captured, told a different story. They spoke of an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources, who replaced losses overnight, who could afford to waste ammunition and supplies because more would arrive tomorrow. One captured Japanese officer, interrogated on Guam in August 1944, provided testimony that American intelligence found particularly revealing. Asked why his unit had surrendered rather than fight to the death, he explained, "We were told that Americans were soft, that they would quit when faced with determined resistance. But softness is relative. When you have so much material that you can afford to be careless with it, caution looks like softness. When you can lose 100 men taking a position because you have 1,000 more behind them, patience looks like weakness. We were not fighting soft soldiers. We were fighting an economic system that treats soldiers as abundant resources." The statement captured something essential about the transformation of warfare that landing craft represented. Industrial capacity had always mattered in war, but it had operated within constraints. Weapons were valuable, soldiers were precious, logistics were carefully managed. The American approach in the Pacific, enabled by landing craft production, among other factors, treated these as abundant rather than scarce. Losses were acceptable because they could be replaced. Waste was tolerable because supply exceeded demand. The entire calculus of military operations had changed, and the change favored the side with greater industrial depth. In October 1944, General Tomoyuki Yamashita arrived in the Philippines to assume command of Japanese forces defending the islands. He was Japan's most successful general, the conqueror of Singapore, a man whose tactical brilliance had earned him the nickname the Tiger of Malaya. He came to the Philippines with no illusions about victory, but with hopes that skilled defense might delay the American advance long enough for diplomatic negotiations to begin. His hopes lasted approximately 4 hours after the American landing at Leyte Gulf began. The invasion fleet that appeared off Leyte on October 20th carried over 700 ships. But what struck Yamashita, reviewing reconnaissance reports in his headquarters in Manila, was not the fleet's size but its composition. The reports counted over 450 landing craft of various types actively participating in the initial assault. Yamashita, who had studied amphibious operations extensively, knew that such numbers represented not merely an abundance of equipment, but a fundamental transformation in operational capability. Traditional amphibious doctrine, the kind Yamashita had learned and practiced, treated each landing as a carefully orchestrated operation requiring days of preparation and execution. The attacking force would suppress coastal defenses with naval gunfire, land initial waves to secure a beachhead, then gradually build up forces ashore over days or weeks. Defenders who could survive the initial assault and maintain cohesion had opportunities to counterattack, to disrupt the build-up, to turn the landing into a costly failure. This doctrine assumed that landing craft were limited, that getting troops ashore was the bottleneck, that time favored the defender. The American landing at Leyte violated every assumption. In the first 6 hours, over 60,000 troops came ashore across multiple beaches simultaneously. The landing craft operated in continuous rotation, hitting the beach, discharging troops or vehicles, retracting, and returning to the ships for more. The tempo never slowed. When Japanese artillery destroyed landing craft, they were simply replaced. When one beach became congested, others were opened. By nightfall of the first day, over 130,000 troops were ashore, with their equipment, supplies, and supporting artillery. Yamashita issued orders for counterattacks, but the orders arrived at units that no longer existed or were already retreating from American advances. The speed of the American buildup made conventional defense impossible. Positions that should have held for days were overrun in hours because American forces could mass troops faster than Japanese units could reinforce. The mathematics of attrition that Japanese planning relied upon broke down when the enemy could replace losses in real time. In his diary, captured after the war, Yamashita wrote extensively about the landing craft. One entry from October 22nd is particularly revealing. "I have fought Americans in Malaya, where they were few and poorly supplied. I assumed the difference in the Philippines would be one of scale, that they would have more of everything but operate under similar constraints. I was wrong. They do not operate under constraints. Their landing craft come and go like taxicabs in a city. They have so many that individual losses are meaningless. How does one defend against an enemy for whom logistics is not a limiting factor?" The question had no satisfactory answer. Yamashita reorganized his defense, abandoning the coasts and withdrawing into the interior mountains where American material advantages would be reduced. It was sound tactics given the circumstances, but it was also an admission that conventional defense was impossible. The landing craft had given Americans the ability to land wherever they chose, with whatever force they deemed necessary, and Japanese forces could not contest the landings themselves. The battle for the Philippines continued until the war's end, with Japanese forces in the mountains holding out in isolated pockets. But the outcome was never in doubt from the moment the landing craft began arriving at Leyte. Yamashita's forces, cut off from resupply and unable to prevent American landings at multiple points, could only delay the inevitable. When Yamashita surrendered in September 1945, over 200,000 Japanese soldiers had died in the Philippines. American casualties were also severe, but the strategic result was absolute. The Philippines were liberated, Japan's defensive perimeter was breached, and the home islands lay exposed to invasion. The landing craft made that liberation possible. Without them, the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific could not have maintained its tempo. Each operation would have required concentrating all available amphibious assets, leaving other theaters static. With them, multiple operations could proceed simultaneously, stretching Japanese defenses beyond breaking. Yamashita understood this in the mountains of Luzon, watching American supplies arrive on beaches his forces could not reach. The war had become a contest between production and destruction, and production had won. By early 1945, Japanese military planning had fully absorbed the lesson of American landing craft capacity. The operational orders for defending Iwo Jima and Okinawa no longer assumed that landing forces could be defeated on the beaches. Instead, the strategy focused entirely on making the Americans pay the maximum price for each yard of territory, on inflicting casualties so severe that invasion of the home islands would seem unbearable. The landing craft themselves were no longer even mentioned in Japanese defensive planning. Their abundance was simply accepted as an unchangeable reality. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the defense of Iwo Jima, wrote to his family before the battle, "The Americans will arrive with more ships and equipment than we can count. They will land wherever they choose, in whatever numbers they deem necessary. We cannot prevent the landing, we can only make them regret it." His defensive plan reflected this assessment. Rather than concentrating forces at the beaches, he deployed them in depth, in fortified positions throughout the island's interior. The beaches themselves would be lightly defended, allowing Americans to land easily, then subjecting them to intense fire from hidden positions once they advanced inland. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, over 480 landing craft participated in the assault waves. Kuribayashi's troops held their fire initially, allowing the beaches to fill with Marines and equipment. Then the hidden artillery and mortars opened fire, creating precisely the kind of killing zone Kuribayashi had planned. The casualties were horrific. The Marines suffered over 26,000 casualties in the 36-day battle, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Yet the strategic outcome was never in doubt. The landing craft kept coming. Hour after hour, day after day, they delivered reinforcements, supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment. When casualties mounted, more Marines arrived. When tanks were destroyed, more tanks came ashore. When artillery pieces were knocked out, new guns were unloaded and positioned. The material continuity was absolute. Kuribayashi's troops fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill, but they were fighting an enemy who could sustain losses that would have broken any conventional army. Kuribayashi himself died in the final days of the battle, leading a last desperate counterattack. His body was never found, but his prediction proved accurate. The Americans regretted the casualties on Iwo Jima deeply. The images of Marines struggling up Mount Suribachi, the rows of graves in the military cemeteries, the thousands of wounded sent home all contributed to American public debate about the costs of the Pacific War. Yet the island was taken, its airfields were operational within days, and B-29 bombers flying from Iwo Jima to Japan had emergency landing sites that saved thousands of American aircrew lives. The battle for Okinawa, beginning on April 1, 1945, dwarfed even Iwo Jima in scale and cost. Over 1,400 ships participated in the operation, including more than 800 landing craft of various types. The landing itself proceeded with almost routine efficiency. Over 60,000 troops came ashore on the first day across 8 miles of beaches. Within a week, over 180,000 American troops were on Okinawa with complete logistical support. The battle lasted 82 days and cost over 12,000 American lives and at least 70,000 Japanese military casualties. The fighting was savage, with Japanese forces employing every tactic from prepared defensive positions to kamikaze attacks to guerrilla warfare. Yet throughout the battle, the American supply line never faltered. The landing craft that had brought the troops ashore continued operating, bringing supplies, evacuating wounded, repositioning units. The abundance of landing craft meant that logistical challenges that would have crippled earlier campaigns were simply solved by allocating more vessels. For Japanese commanders still resisting elsewhere in the Pacific, the fall of Okinawa represented a final confirmation of what many had already concluded. Conventional military resistance against an enemy with such overwhelming material advantages was futile. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding Okinawa's defense, committed suicide rather than surrender, but his final communications to Tokyo contained no strategic recommendations, no suggestions for future defense. There was nothing left to recommend. The Americans could land anywhere, sustain any operation, replace any losses. Military skill and fighting spirit, while still mattering tactically, could not overcome such disparities. The American planning staff, preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands scheduled for November 1945, allocated over 6,000 landing craft for the initial assault on Kyushu alone. An additional 8,000 were designated for the subsequent landing on Honshu. These numbers represented not just production capacity, but a completely transformed understanding of amphibious warfare. Landing craft were no longer specialized vessels for specific operations, but standard equipment produced in whatever quantities operations required. The scarcity that had constrained amphibious operations throughout military history had been eliminated through industrial production. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Operation Downfall commenced. The landing craft prepared for the invasion were eventually sent to scrapyards or sold as surplus. But their existence, their sheer numbers, had helped shape Japanese decision-making in the war's final months. The knowledge that America could launch amphibious invasions of the home islands with effectively unlimited resources contributed to the sense of hopelessness among Japanese military leaders. Even before the atomic bombs demonstrated yet another dimension of American technological and industrial superiority. In September 1945, United States strategic bombing survey teams fanned out across occupied Japan, interviewing military and civilian officials, examining captured documents, reconstructing the Japanese perspective on the war. One question appeared repeatedly in these interviews: when did you realize Japan could not win the war? The answers varied, but a surprising number of military officers cited specific moments when they observed American landing craft operations. Not the bombings of cities, not the destruction of the fleet at Philippine Sea, not even the loss of specific islands, but the sight of landing craft arriving in such numbers that resistance seemed pointless. Vice Admiral Motomi Ugaki, who survived the war and was interviewed extensively, provided particularly thoughtful testimony. He had been Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto, had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, had witnessed the entire arc of the Pacific War from initial triumph to final defeat. When asked about the war's turning point, he spoke at length about landing craft. We expected Americans to be strong. We knew they would have more ships, more planes, more tanks. But we believed there were limits, that at some point their logistics would reach maximum capacity and we could exploit that moment. The landing craft taught us we were wrong. When a nation can produce such vessels by the thousands, there are no logistics limits to exploit. We were fighting an industrial system that could simply manufacture solutions to any problem. The production statistics bear out his assessment. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry produced 41,498 landing craft of all types. This number exceeded the total tonnage of the Japanese merchant marine at the war's beginning. More landing craft were built than tanks, more than bombers, more than virtually any other category of military equipment except small arms and ammunition. The investment of resources was staggering, representing hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of millions of man-hours of labor. Yet the investment proved strategically decisive. The landing craft enabled the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces from Australia to Japan's doorstep in 3 years. They allowed multiple simultaneous operations that stretched Japanese defenses to breaking. They made possible the liberation of the Philippines, the capture of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the positioning of forces for the planned invasion of Japan. Without them, the Pacific War would have lasted years longer, cost hundreds of thousands more lives, perhaps ended with negotiated settlement rather than unconditional surrender. The Japanese commanders who stood on beaches from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and watched landing craft arrive in impossible numbers were witnessing the transformation of warfare itself. Industrial capacity had always mattered in war, but never before had it been applied with such single-minded purpose to a specific military problem. The landing craft were not technological marvels. They were simple, often crude, built by workers who had never made boats before, using materials from ordinary civilian suppliers. Their power came not from sophistication but from abundance, from the wholesale application of industrial methods to military production. Andrew Jackson Higgins, whose boat design made this abundance possible, received numerous awards and honors after the war. President Eisenhower called him the man who won the war for us, an overstatement perhaps, but one reflecting genuine appreciation for his contribution. Higgins himself remained characteristically blunt about his achievement. "We didn't invent anything revolutionary. We just built boats the way Ford builds cars, and we built enough of them that running out was impossible." That impossibility, that sense that American resources were effectively infinite, was what broke Japanese strategic planning. Every defensive calculation required assumptions about enemy capabilities, about how many troops they could land, how many supplies they could bring forward, how many losses they could sustain. When those assumptions proved wrong by factors of 10 or 20, when the enemy demonstrated capability that exceeded worst-case estimates, rational planning became impossible. Japanese forces fought on with courage and determination, but they fought without hope, knowing that material disparities made victory impossible. The veterans of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, both American and Japanese survivors, carried memories of battles where landing craft formed the constant background to every action. Marines remembered the sound of ramps dropping, the dash from craft to beach, the knowledge that more craft were behind them bringing reinforcements and supplies. Japanese soldiers remembered the futility of destroying enemy vessels, knowing that more would simply appear, that their ammunition would run out before the enemy's landing craft did. In the decades after the war, as historians analyzed the Pacific campaign, the landing craft often appeared as footnotes, mentioned in passing as logistical details. The dramatic narratives focused on carrier battles, on marine assaults, on the atomic bombs. But to the men who planned and fought the campaigns, the landing craft represented something more fundamental than any single battle. They represented the triumph of industrial production over military tradition, of quantity over quality, of systematic planning over tactical brilliance. Admiral Tomano, who had watched the landing craft arrive at Iwo Jima with such disbelief, survived the war and spent years analyzing Japan's defeat. In a memoir published in the 1950s, he returned repeatedly to that morning on the beach. "I had spent 30 years learning the art of naval warfare. I knew tactics, strategy, the mathematics of fleet engagements. But I had never considered that warfare could be transformed into a production problem, that the side which could build more landing craft would dictate the terms of battle. We Japanese prided ourselves on fighting spirit, on tactical excellence, on willingness to sacrifice. We believed these qualities could overcome material disadvantages. The landing craft taught us otherwise. You cannot sink a factory with fighting spirit. You cannot destroy a production line with tactical brilliance. We fought soldiers and lost to industry." That lesson, learned at such cost across the islands of the Pacific, remains relevant in any age where industrial capacity shapes military power. The landing craft were not the most sophisticated weapons of the Second World War, not the most glamorous, not the ones that dominate historical memory, but they were the ones that Japanese commanders could not account for, could not counter, could not match. They were the visible symbol of an industrial capacity so vast that it could treat major weapons systems as disposable commodities, produce them in such quantities that individual losses became irrelevant. On the beaches where Marines came ashore from those simple plywood boats, memorials now stand commemorating courage and sacrifice. The landing craft themselves are mostly gone, scrapped after the war or left to rust in military storage depots. A few survive in museums, testament to a time when American industry remade warfare through the wholesale application of production methods to military problems. They are unremarkable to look at, these simple boats, nothing in their appearance suggesting world historical importance. But they changed the war. They made possible operations that Japanese planners had calculated were impossible. They broke defensive strategies built on assumptions of scarcity and limitation. They demonstrated that in modern war, industrial capacity deployed with sufficient scale and purpose could overcome any defensive position, any tactical skill, any amount of courage and determination. The Japanese commanders who watched them arrive, wave after wave, beach after beach, year after year, learned that lesson completely. They could not believe how many landing craft Americans had built in 3 years. By the time they understood, understanding came too late to matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.